Good morning, comrades. You're listening to WHIVLP New Orleans 102.3. This is your weekly Good Morning Comrade, the number one socialist radio program in the New Orleans area. We got Jeff and Robert on the show. Robert, how you doing, homie?
All right. I just ran home from work and grabbed all my stuff and then realized we didn't even bring the right stuff to record. So we're doing this very ad hoc.
We're in the same room for the first time in 2 years. But we do also have a guest here today. We have the city council member from St. Petersburg, Florida, Richie Floyd. Richie, introduce yourself to the lovely WHIV listeners.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for having me. Like you said, my name is Richie Floyd. I'm city council member for St. Petersburg, Florida, District 8, and got elected in 2021. So I'm about halfway through my first term and excited to be here.
Yeah, I remember when you got elected, it was one of those sorts of things. And I have, you and I actually have some friends of friends that are common. And there was a lot of excitement around it, around that, because we're somebody who actually has connections with the community, and you're actually a DSA member, and you're actually working with actual community to push an agenda that actually helps people. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
I mean, sure. That's quite broad. So
we can definitely drill down as we go. But the generals, yeah.
We can talk a little bit about how I got elected. I think that's really important in this conversation. I was not a member of the political establishment, I guess. So, it's city council, but a lot of people
former school teacher.
Yeah,
I mean,
exactly,
you say your spouse is a school teacher. I'm a former school teacher. I mean, we're doing God's work over here, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, I that was my last job before I was a city council member, and my wife still does it, and so I had just been, organizing in my DSA chapter, but more broadly as well. I had done statewide organizing with SEIU actually on the Fight for 15 that we had here in 2020, and sort of was looking for someone else to run for city council in District 8 whenever the last council member was going out because of term limits, and ended up everybody coalescing around myself doing it instead. And so we ran a grassroots campaign. We went from being a relatively unknown person in the city to knocking on 30,000 doors, winning our primary by 26 points, and narrowly winning the general election by 1.5 points against a former elected official who last time he was on the ballot, he had been the city council member for this seat. He had won 76% of the vote the last time he had run. He's a good guy. I actually know him. He's decent. I talked to him today. I need to give him a call. But, he got in the race late, was criticizing me for a lack of experience, and it was difficult because St. Pete's elections are kind of weird. We have in-district primaries where the top two vote getters, no matter what. So I got over 50% of the vote in the primary. The top two vote getters go to a citywide general election. I can give you the short reason why that's the case. It's because all the Black people in the city live in one part of the city. And so it makes it a little more difficult for them to elect who they want to represent them when it's like that. So anyway, we went to a citywide general election in which you only have 10 weeks between the primary and the general to actually campaign. So to get the message out citywide, and it was crazy. I think in those 10 weeks, we knocked 12,000 doors, just went absolutely nuts, and raised a ton of money from small dollar donors, and were able to beat someone with name recognition in the end. And so, it was literally from no political experience, my first time running for office, to getting elected citywide.
So I guess one of the first questions I would ask in terms of building that sort of network of volunteers and getting people out to get and support you, what are the things that, one, drew people to your campaign? And then two, what was it what kind of relationships with different organizations did you have to sort of build and maintain to make that actually operational? Because you can have as much appeal to working class people, but if there's no mechanisms to activate them, then it doesn't make it. It's not going to happen. It's just not going to work.
Yeah, well, so that's a really good question, actually, and one thing that people should keep in mind, I had a lot of connections to organizations beforehand. I had been a delegate to the AFL-CIO Labor Council, West Central Florida Labor Council, through my union as a teacher, and so was my wife. I was in DSA, and our DSA chapter works very closely doing labor solidarity work with a lot of different unions in the area. Like I said, I had been a lead volunteer organizer for SEIU statewide. So I had a good relationship with them. And there's other orgs in the area. There's Dream Defenders that I had been participating in for a few years, and just progressive groups in general, environmental groups that I was a member of that I just casually participated in. And so I knew going in the issues that all of these people cared about, and the issues that working people in general cared about. And, as far as like building like an actual campaign around that, there's two things I'd say. First was, the general excitement of like having a viable left-wing campaign going forward, one. And then two, we had fun. And, we're running another campaign right now. We're having a blast. And so, every weekend we would go canvass, and after the canvass we would get pizza in the park. We would come back to my house and have a barbecue. We would post memes like about the campaign. We invited people to come from other DSA chapters in the state, and some people came from as far away as California, just to come visit people who had connections to the area. So yeah, it was we just had a lot of fun, actually, I think was a big part of it as well. And took it very seriously, but made sure it was a good time for everybody.
Yeah, it's like one of those sorts of things where the purpose of coming together for doing these kinds of things is not to do the fun. But like if you're not having fun, then people aren't going to want to do the work. So like there's just sort of a balance there. You mentioned that there were certain particular issues, and I know, like, I mean, when people think about, oh, it's Florida, it's like one of these places where, the sort of, what's his name? The governor over there. DeSantis like just runs the whole, sorry. Trigger warning, Ron DeSantis. But like when people do sort of think about Florida, I mean, and like obviously there's differences between urban and rural areas. We have the same issues in Louisiana and Virginia and everywhere that we have experience, and everywhere in the country, really. It's not like no state is a unicorn in that aspect. But I guess when it comes to like this particulars of running the campaign in the South, what are the issues that resonated people, and what are some of the sort of oppositions that you saw?
So, the first thing to know just about like running a campaign in Florida, and I always tell people this, I'm like, are there working class people in Florida? Yes. And they're going to respond well to a working class issue. Like, yeah. And so, but the biggest thing that we have in our city, and I think it was the case whenever I was running, and it's only gotten worse since then, is the cost of living in the city has just absolutely skyrocketed. Like I mentioned, I was a teacher previously. My wife's a teacher. I was only a teacher for a brief time. I was an engineer before that. And we bought a house here in 2019, and the value of it has easily doubled since then. To the point where we're like, I don't know what we would do if we were still renting now. Like, it would be a very difficult decision. Obviously, to make.
with the cost of that property goes the cost of rent, like almost like lock that value, or potentially even more, almost like
worse, maybe, yeah. And so, we had year-over-year rent increases of 25-30%. A few years ago, and they've stabilized a little bit now, but the price is up now. And so that's been the biggest issue is I say the cost of living, but affordable housing in general. To be more specific, affordable housing has been the biggest issue in the city. And the city has, I would describe it as feigned interest in this topic. I mean, I think that maybe the majority of people in power are sympathetic to it, but they've been stuck in a rigid old formula that's just like subsidized development in order to get affordable housing. And so we've been running big campaigns for the last couple of years to try to earn more tenants' rights, which were really successful until Ron DeSantis came in and the state government made it illegal for us to do that anymore. And
another, by the way, before we go on, another common theme across states is statewide issues preempting local initiatives. I'm sorry, continue.
No,
moment.
I assume that that's the exact same thing in New Orleans, like preemption coming in and telling you what you can and can't do. I'm optimistic here. Like, I've got plenty of ideas around it, but it's going to take some time to enact.
At some level, it has to be contest for power at the state level. I mean, that's one of the things that needs to happen with organizations like DSA. We need to level up in terms of our ability to contest for power at state legislatures, not just at the national and the local levels.
Well, absolutely, but absolutely. In addition, though, let me clarify. Like, is preemption the problem, or is it what they're preempting that's the problem? So,
both.
if this, exactly. If the state government, if say there was a strong movement among all sorts of progressive forces to get into the state government, I would hope that we would say, hey, local municipalities, you can no longer allow your contractors to do rampant wage theft on your workers anymore. So it's I don't know. I make the nuance point. Maybe
that's welcome. That's very much welcome, and it actually helps to it helps to sort of clarify these sorts of issues, because when it comes to these governing issues, I guess you could say, is one way to sort of summarize them and all. They're not simple, and they do need to be sort of deeply considered across the board.
Yeah. So the other thing we've been doing on housing is, just advocating for, I don't know what the conversation's been like in New Orleans, but for social housing, mixed income, city owned housing. You're charged based off of how much money you make. There's a tenant board that controls the decisions that get made around it. And it's owned by the public for the public good, and everyone can live there. And we've been advocating for that. We're in a unique situation where the city actually owns some housing itself, but it's deeply subsidized and deeply affordable, which, is not a bad thing, but it's not a sustainable thing either. And so we've been trying to build momentum towards getting the city to actually invest in social housing. But, like I mentioned earlier, it seems like the powers that be, mayor's office, the majority of city council, are more interested in just doing things the way that they've always been done. And so we're just trying to build support for it. We're trying to get another person elected to city council. We've been not lobbying, but bringing the idea up in meetings. So other city council members are kind of interested, but they don't really, buy everything that comes out of my mouth right away. Although I feel like I've done a good job of showing them that, I'm serious. The movement behind me is serious about contesting for power and serious about the issues we put forward. So, but it's still very difficult to get a government to go even an inch out of its way for working people.
That is, to say the least. I mean, that's a little bit of an understatement, perhaps. That
I'm talking a sympathetic government too. There's. Our mayor is a Democrat. We have 7 of the 8 city council members are Democrats. It's very difficult, even if they're oh yeah, we care about affordable housing. It's to get them to do something radical, or even understand why they need to do something radical. It's tough.
That point actually is really important. I think just because of the sort of way that you described it earlier, is that people just want to do things or are comfortable in doing things the way that they've done before. It's almost when you talk to people about these kinds of things. I've had these conversations with people in my union. You mentioned that you were a delegate to the AFL-CIO Central Labor Council, and I was a delegate in New Orleans as well. And sometimes when you just bring up an idea to somebody and you just sort of look at them in their eyes, and they're just I've never thought of that before. You just like paving new roads in their brain, and it's just sort of you have to do a lot of work to kind of hold their hand and walk them down this path towards what you're actually
so
trying
difficult
to
to do that with elected
to like
officials
make the world
too.
better. Yeah. Well, there's also a lot of sort of material incentives to not make those changes, right?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And we have, I don't know how it works in New Orleans, but like we have these, like, they're supposed to be anti-corruption laws called the Sunshine Laws, that mean that I can't talk about anything that could potentially come before city council to another city council member unless we're in a public meeting. And our public meetings are all so structured that like we each get just a couple of minutes to talk and there's not time for back and forth. And so like just to get, like, for example, something small, a tenant protection we won here, a right to counsel program. You know, for those who aren't familiar, a right to counsel program means you get evicted or you're having housing issues. You have a right to legal counsel. You have a right to get a lawyer, come help you and give you legal counsel. So, you know, it's a pretty simple concept that avoids a lot of headaches, not just for tenants, but for landlords too, which you would think would grease the wheels really easily for things. But trying to explain that to them took me a year and a half. And we got it passed, but it was a year and a half of work. And most of it was just explaining it to people in committee meetings over and over again. And them forgetting what happened when we had the last committee meeting 3 months ago, because we're not allowed to talk about it outside the committee meetings. And sure, you know, anti-corruption so that we're not making backroom deals and coming out. That's good, right? Well, the thing is that the state made it to where the local government's anti-corruption laws are super stringent, but the state's laws are like, oh, as long as you have 9 or less people in the room, you can do whatever you want. But in the city council, it's one-on-one. You cannot have that conversation. It makes it very difficult for us to operate.
That's interesting you say that, because we were talking before we started recording that, I'm from St. Pete. That's my hometown. And my dad bought a house in Norwood, stocking shelves at the Home Depot on 34th Street. And, like, that is impossible now. Like, he's going to die in that house. And, like, I'm glad that he got it, but, like, he can't move. Like, there's nowhere affordable. I left in the 2000s when it was getting bad. And I just got out of the Marine Corps, and I couldn't afford to live there anymore. I can't imagine that. I know my friends are still living there, and I'm like, I don't know how they're living there. I have no idea. And it just feels like we had such an influx of capital and even government assistance after the race riots in the 90s that now it seems like, you know, all these investors and people who brought up property, it seems like they're fine. They think that can never happen again. They think that if they push people to the margins, then we won't be back in the same situation, if not 5 years from now, or 10 years or 20 years. And it's like, we're just going to keep doing this cycle. It seems insane.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, to your point, I feel like I'm trapped in my house as well. And I'm an elected official. There's no chance of me being able to sell this and move somewhere else. My taxes will go up. My down payment will be massive. I don't even need to mention interest rates. That's outside of the city's control. But yeah, and it's.
Yeah, I hope y'all are happy where you live, or else, right?
It's all right. Yeah, I like it. No, I do love where I live, which is a serious blessing. But you're right. I mean, and we are having some serious issues in the city that I think some people are in denial about. Our city has historically been very segregated, but with a large African American population. And the city has been losing like 4,000 Black people a year lately based off of census data. And, you know,
that's
people want to dispute it. Yeah, it's the first time it's happened since the 70s. And people want to dispute it, but it's what the census data says, or they want to make excuses for it, but it's not cool. And what I think is really telling about it is that it's not just that Black people are leaving, but that's a stand-in for just working class people in general. And because, you know, we don't have the data about income or whatever, but working class people in general are being forced out of the city. People are always like, wow, there's so many new people in St. Pete. Like, our population must be booming. Our population is growing at like 1% per year. We're just rapidly replacing people in the city.
Mm-hmm.
Like, just a new demographic economically is moving in constantly. Our area median income, which is like a number that we use to calculate how much affordable housing is going to cost, is going up like $10,000 a year. And our population's not, and wages aren't. It's just that we're being rapidly replaced with more people with more money, and it's
that is literally like fast. That is fast motion, like actual gentrification in action. That is what it is, right?
Yeah, it's very frustrating too, and it's just seems to be ignored and not not
it's
addressed
like
at the local level.
Quicksand. Like you think about it, like quicksand, like just almost like you try and like move forward and you're sinking into the sort of like never ending morass. That's I don't know, makes it impossible for working people to survive.
Yeah, it's frustrating to say the least. And it's just the people who are still here, like, are just people like your dad, Robert, or myself, who just bought a house and were lucky enough to stay in it and hopefully are happy in it. But the truth is that, like, I mean, this isn't news to y'all, but cities require working people, and society requires working people, and working people are always going to be the majority. And it doesn't matter like how expensive things get. It just means that working people are going to have to struggle to survive somehow, because that's all we can do, and we're required to be here. And so, like you mentioned, just like people getting pushed to the margins, and how bad things can get when stuff like that happens.
Yeah, it's just, I mean, for people who are listening, worldwide, and especially for the people who are living here in New Orleans who are listening to this, like, New Orleans is not that segregated of a city. We have like blocks and neighborhoods, but I could tell you pretty much 90% accuracy what race you are in St. Petersburg is by, do you live north or south of Central Avenue? And that's always set weird with me. And that's just how it's been since my grandparents moved there. And it's just not, it's not sustainable. I've heard this from my dad, like, for forever, like, this isn't sustainable. This isn't sustainable. And it feels like the chickens are finally coming home to roost.
Yeah. So I moved to St. Pete after college for a job, and I wanted to live here. I thought it was a wonderful place. I'd visited plenty of times, and whenever I finally lived here and like got to know the city, I was stunned at the level of segregation. Like, it's like shocking, like jarring. I'm from Florida, lived in Florida my whole life, grew up in the Panhandle in a town called Fort Walton Beach. It's not too far from New Orleans, about 3.5 hour drive, actually. And
actually, I used to live in Destin after Hurricane Katrina were evacuated.
Oh, wow. Okay, yeah. So there was a lot of people that moved from New Orleans to Fort Walton as well after Hurricane Katrina.
My brother went to Fort Walton Beach High. Danny Werfel, who used to play for the Saints, has like a highway named after him, which is very funny.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And so, but that was a military town, like Eglin Air Force Base.
Still is
biggest
to
military
a certain extent,
base. Yeah, it's a military town. Yes, my family lives there. My dad works on the Air Force Base, and it's really diverse and it's really integrated. Like, the military brings all sorts of different kinds of people to the city, and it's really integrated. To move to St. Pete and see how segregated it was like a punch in the face. Like, I couldn't believe it. And still, just how, like, just the fact that I work with people from all across the city and, participate in events in North St. Pete and in South St. Pete is still not the norm necessarily. People like elected officials from South St. Pete will get out and about, in North St. Pete. Elected officials from North St. Pete, some of them do, some of them, I don't know, so it's sort of the tale of two cities to an extent, but when you pull that back and you look at class, working class people, no matter where they're living at in the city, are definitely struggling to get by right now.
Yeah, because that's just to give a little more context. Like, it's super interesting too that it's not even class. It's not even like, oh, you go down like on the south side of St. Pete and it's just like, oh, this is where all the poor people are. Like, no, this is literally where all the people of color are. And there are large swaths of upper and middle class people of color living in, say, I'm thinking of like Maximo, I'm thinking of like Lakewood neighborhood, stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
But still, like, those lines just don't cross.
Mm-hmm.
Like, for people in New Orleans, it's like going to the south side for somebody who lives in the north is like, on the north side is like going to the West Bank, crossing the Mississippi River. It's just a really weird setup, and I'm still surprised that it just all this time hasn't really been addressed yet to like kind of make the city whole, which is I don't know. It's just, it feels so weird and gross.
Mm-hmm. Well, it was a big news story whenever I got elected. I was the first Black person to get elected in North St. Pete, and the first Black person to beat a white person citywide in like 15 or 20 years. I did that also, though, in addition to the mayor, be the first African-American mayor getting elected as well. And so I was optimistic when I got elected that things would, be changing. But the forces of gentrification have doubled or tripled in the last few years, and things have not been on a good footing. So, and I know New Orleans is acutely aware of the forces of gentrification. I've seen the things about vacation rentals and empty blocks and everything. And so
canvassing in New Orleans. I know I've done canvassing in here for like various, Medicare for all and for, anti-gentrification measures, et cetera, and there's entire blocks of just Airbnbs. It's just crazy. Like, nobody lives in certain parts of the city anymore. It's wild.
Wow. It's like a movie set.
Wow. We are fortunate. We have an ordinance that regulates short-term rentals here. And it's not perfect. We can't change it because the state preempted it and it's grandfathered in. But it does exist. And we actually have someone from our DSA chapter who was in the newspaper recently because she has made a hobby out of reporting illegal short-term rentals constantly. She reported like 100 within a month or something, and like 88 of them got violations. And
wow.
Yeah, was a really interesting story. She still does it, but not to the same extent, I believe. But it also was kind of scary. Like, she was getting like threats and stuff from property owners, investors who just want to say to hell with the rules and keep doing what they're doing. And so, but we're fortunate to even have that ordinance on the books. Otherwise, it would be just game on and the Wild West here as well. And I shudder to think about what that would look like.
Yeah. You mentioned earlier, I guess before we can do that, you pause for station ID. You listen to WHIVLP New Orleans 102.3. This is Good Morning Comrade. Jeff and Robert on the show with our very special guest, a council member of St. Petersburg, Florida, Richie Floyd. And I wanted to sort of ask about some of the coalition that you mentioned. You mentioned you're a DSA member, and there's several other groups that you were working with. How, in terms of like the support that those groups have given to you in terms of your winning your election, and then in terms of like how things have gone in terms of like maintaining relationships. I know this is another huge question that we can drill down on, but sort of like, can we just talk a little bit about sort of how that has gone from where it started into sort of like where it's at and where we think it might be going?
So, I think it's a really important thing that you brought up here. A lot of organizations that, campaigned with me, helped me get elected, have stayed engaged. Their leadership calls me. I come to their meetings as often as I can. And we talk about the things that are happening in the city. And, I give report backs to their members, and work hand in hand with them to get things accomplished. But some of them I haven't heard from, and I reach out to, and I don't hear back, and they spend a lot of time like getting people elected, and then not a lot of time engaging them later for a variety of reasons. Like they're short staffed, or they don't have the capacity, or they're just busy with something else. For example, like unions lately, like it's been a mixed bag, depends on what union it is, because like if you're a public sector union, the state has been coming after you, trying to kill you for like the last year,
a knife and a gun,
so,
and just like trying to just take you out.
So like I understand when I don't hear from some of them for a long time, but I think it's really important, and I think like the left in general needs to think about like what engagement looks like with elected officials afterwards, because your electoral operation is not just this person's elected, they're going to make the right decisions. Like I got elected, and all of a sudden it's a whole new game. Like it's completely different from campaigning. Legislating is very tricky. There's a lot of laws to learn, a lot of questions to ask. There's procedure, and there's just the basic idea of like, how do I accomplish these ideas that we so strongly support and campaigned on? How do I get them across the finish line once I'm here? And I think, whatever progressive or left-wing force is interested in getting things done needs to be interested in like engaging with legislators to try to get them done. And so it's been a mixed bag, really, is how I would describe it mostly.
Yeah. So, and you mentioned communication, like that seems like an issue. Like one of the things that I've noticed, at least in my sort of experience in some of these organizations, at least, well, I'll talk specifically about DSA because that's where my experience lies for the most part. There seems to be this sort of like thought, and maybe you'll feel some, I don't know where you're at on this, but like it feels that like if you just draw like there's this impulse internally that if they just draw up like enough rules for elected officials that we endorse or support to follow, like that will mean that the relationship will just kind of like autopilot itself or something like that. And like that thing, at least to me, I only see that as something that can be potentially negative. Like it's almost like, oh, here's the rules, you broke the rules, we revoke our endorsement or whatever. And that seems to be, to me, like a very like non-social way to sort of approach these kinds of things. I don't know, like that's just kind of where my brain started at. But maybe we've seen some of this other stuff happening also with like some nationally elected figures as well. And like the idea of like putting pressure on elected, holding them accountable, like I don't know, communicating them with they were a human being first, like I don't know, that seems like to be the priority, and like maybe the steps in that sort of progression.
Yeah, I hear where you're coming from, and tend to agree with you. I'd say, having clear rules outlined from the get-go is very important.
Not a bad thing. Definitely not a bad
thing. It's very important, and I think it's been missing. Like we've been sort of inserting like, oh, you cross this line here later on after, the understanding at the beginning was something else. And so I think that's been a difficulty for a lot of people, but I do think what you're getting at is like, how DSA interacts with its elected officials has been a lot of the conversation has all been about the stick approach, like in carrot versus stick, and that is a contention that I have is there's no carrot at all. Like there's no like, hey, come over, and like, is the idea that, well, there just shouldn't have to be one, you should just be doing the right thing.
Okay.
Maybe, I guess, but
how do you maintain your position though? I mean, like, how do you maintain the position on city council if like without some kind of like way to make that continue forward, right? Like I'm not even kidding. Like that is necessary. Like there could be somebody who comes up in the next election who's like, look at this guy who is pushing for social housing or whatever, and I'm against that. And then when the DSA group has already hypothetically, I'm putting you in an unfortunate position, I'm sorry, but like council member X, they had already condemned them publicly or whatever. How do you reestablish that position and not have the bad thing happen?
Yeah, well, I hear what you're saying, and I think it's a conversation for every, I guess, chapter in the national organization to have. But like, I want to frame it slightly differently in
Mhm.
that. So the way that I operate is like, if I have something crucial coming up, my DSA chapter knows about it because I like
Mhm.
bring it up to them. I'm like, hey, this is what's going on. Also, we're nerds who all are paying attention to city council all the time. So works really easily because they know what's going on all the time. And we just have conversations about things, and that works really well. You know, the where it starts to get sticky is the national organization has no idea what I'm up to at all.
Mhm.
Like, and this is like where it, but if they have no idea what I'm up to, negative or positive, I could have like done something absolutely horrific and they wouldn't have any inkling of it at all.
Mhm.
And so uh that I think is a serious problem. And it's, I mentioned it to you all earlier, but um it's not just carrot and stick. It's like, what is the relationship like, and how much are we focusing on the dozens or hundreds of elected officials at a local and state level that participate in their chapters and make collective decisions with them, and not just our chapters, but I do it with the labor movement and
Mhm.
environmental organizations like the Sierra Club, uh, and you know, how, what does that look like having a robust like back and forth conversation with them look like, and that level of nuance has not been what the conversation's been
Mhm.
like across the country.
Mhm. And it's also something that does take a significant amount of investment. It takes a lot of care. It takes a lot of just sort of like maintaining, like it takes a lot of trust. Honestly, I mean, it's just like one of those sorts of things. There has to be sort of a we're in this sort of together, and there has to be an assumption at least that you are at least going to do the right thing. When it comes to an elected official, obviously there's got to be some kind of skepticism towards it as well in terms of how far that trust goes. But it almost needs to be. It cannot be a rigid sort of like rules entirely rules based thing. There needs to be a relationship involved. Is I guess my point here.
Yeah, no, that's basically what I'm getting at as well. Like,
Mm-hmm.
there just needs to be like open communication back and
Mm-hmm.
forth, and to begin with. You know, if I ever like you see me take a vote on something, like the question isn't like what was he thinking. The question is like, there is no question like that. It's because I went and talked to like the stakeholders that were invested in the question in the first place, in the decision in the first place, and came
Mm-hmm.
to sort of a collective understanding of how we thought the issue should be tackled. And you know, that's a mix of organizations, like I mentioned, the
Mm-hmm.
labor movement, environmental orgs, progressive orgs, DSA, you know, constituents that the issue might directly affect. And all of those factors are weighed uh, in a collective manner before any decision is made, really. And I'm just there, like, you know, if it's something that has to happen in a split second, an amendment that gets thrown up or something, that's where it's like, okay, now we have to like, yeah, let go and trust that the person we elected is
Yeah.
going to make the best decision we made, and also understand that like, if you don't like the decision I make, like that's fine, but it's a strategic question at that point. Like it
Mm-hmm.
wasn't like a moral question either. And you can probably have a discussion about how far of a strategic like uh, delta you want between you and your elected official, but that's what the conversation is.
Yeah, and again, the at least and it's not even necessarily a problem that we're asking these questions. Like the norm, at least in the in the broader context of things, is that there is no dialogue. The representative essentially, the city council member, the whatever, just sort of like does whatever, love it or lump it, and the only thing that ever matters is the election. So like maintaining those relationships is important because if you don't have that relationship, you're just making it on a guy or a gal or whatever.
Yeah, and you know, the job again is just very different when you get here. And like, I'll just say this, like elected officials, like we need help from anywhere we can get it. I spent like, I don't know, the first 6 months of being elected frustrated that a lot of the organizations that helped get me elected did not have a guide like, here's how you navigate where you are now, and came to the realization that, like, I guess I have to do that myself.
Yep.
And so I'm looking forward to the next person who comes behind me not having to do that, but I had to do it, and it was terrible. And it took a long time to really get my legs under me, understand all the procedural hurdles that I had to overcome, understand how the budget process works, how to get legislation through, what legislation.
There's a zillion rules. There's a
Mm-hmm.
zillion rules. There's a zillion relationships. There's a zillion stakeholders, and they all come up like popping up like mushrooms all the time, don't they?
Mm-hmm. So I just think, if we spend some time thinking about our electoralism as what happens afterwards, after the election, like, it would definitely do everyone some good.
Totally. Robert?
I guess I would say, so for people who are looking to run for office in the near future, what are some of the pitfalls of, like, hey, you should at least, you and your team should be preparing for this if you won? What does that look like? Like, you don't have to go into super details, but just where would somebody find that information? I know, like, you've got your old hand, as is called in electoral politics, of somebody who's been there, done that before, and then they can kind of guide you through it. But how did that process look like for you, trying to build that workflow, I guess, for a lack of a better word, from the ground up, and not having it?
I mean, yeah, what did it look like? Like, once I got elected, it's honestly a lot of time I spend leaning on like, it's going to be different based off the legislative office you're in, or executive office, if that was to happen. But I've had to lean on, like, the city attorneys to tell me, like, how legislation can be put forward. I also get advice from community justice attorneys that are in the local area as to, where the bounds can be pushed, and bounce that advice off of the city attorney. I literally, trial and error is a big part of it. It took a long time, but for certain issues, but, like, one thing you do is literally, I got there and I just started putting in, like, what we call new business items, like proposed legislation, and just, like, fought on them until the bitter end, basically. And you throw a lot of stuff at the wall, and some of it sticks and most of it doesn't. But in the end, like, if you even pass one thing, you've made people's lives slightly better. And so, and as time goes on, you kind of you're like, oh, wow, that didn't work. And yeah, sometimes, I ask people who were elected officials before that I have a decent relationship with. I'm like, hey, can you give me some advice on this or that? And they're usually willing to help. But it's a lot of effort. And they say, like, they talk about, like, master legislators and stuff. Like, I don't know, I think Lyndon Johnson or something. Like, these are people who did the job for like 25 years or something, and like 25 years later. Nowadays, especially local office, all these term limits, like, there's none of that. Like, I've heard stories about previous city council members being like, oh, I didn't understand the budget process until my second term. And then you get 4 years and then you're out, and then somebody else comes in and they don't understand the legislative process at all. And they're on the same thing. I understand the budget process. I got it. It was confusing for the first year, but I understood it the next year. Yeah, so it's really a lot of guess and checks. One of the things, like, people say happened in Florida when they instituted term limits for the state legislature. It's when, like, all the lobbyists basically got in power, and now we're just like a lobbyist state. Yeah.
No. So, like, that's another one of those sorts of things that, like, because the lobbyists don't ever go away. And so when you think about, and maybe you have a different opinion, Robert, maybe you have a different opinion than me on this, but, like, it's not that, like, when you mention that you have these new people coming in to, like, fill these positions of, rep or city council member or whatever, and they're out after 1 or 2 terms, like, the idea of term limits potentially helps the lobbyists, and it helps the interests that are not necessarily the constituencies of those elected officials.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely can be the case. I think, to focus in on like the term limits themselves is not the right solution. A much more correct solution would be to focus in on like our economic system, the incentives that elected officials have, the lobbyist and the nature of the lobbying that's going on and the amount of money that's being input into it. We should just have much more strict regulations on things like lobbying. We should have much more strict regulations on things like campaign donations. And, then term limits can be overcome. But at the same time, having term limits does contribute to meaning that whoever has the institutional knowledge, the new legislator is going to go find right away. And that's going to be the lobbyist. And so, it's sort of a combination of things. I understand people's impulse for term limits. And I think, for an executive position, that makes a lot of sense. But it's definitely got some downside that I think is not always considered.
Yeah. You listen to BHIV LP New Orleans 102.3. This is Good Morning Comrade. You mentioned earlier, this is Richie Floyd, by the way, council member from St. Petersburg, Florida. You mentioned earlier a little bit specifically about the sort of relationship with, specifically for DSA, the relationship with the national organization and how that can be contentious. And like we've definitely seen, at least at the national level, with some of these high-profile electeds like AOC or whatever. And sorry to keep bringing that up, but like the relationship could be like extremely like visibly like outwardly contentious. And like I'm sort of like thinking to myself as I see some of these kinds of things play out on this like it's a very online stage, I guess, but also like there's definitely a component of it where like it gets picked up by right-wing media, like when the National Political Committee revoked their endorsement of AOC or whatever. I almost like look at that and I think to myself, why would anybody want to get national endorsement from DSA if that's the amount of like level of grief that they might have to undergo? That's, I don't know, that might be kind of a spicy one for you.
Also,
but
what is DSA bringing?
What does DSA bring to the table? And like,
yeah.
Look, I'm saying this coming from like as a member, again, co-chair of a chapter. I'm not trying to be like FDSA or whatever, but it's almost like one of these kinds of questions of like, at what point does the Jews no longer become worth the squeeze?
Yeah, I mean, it's a fair question, and I think Robert said it really well. Like, what I understand people's frustration. Like,
totally.
This elected official is doing something that's contrary to our values. Sure, I get that.
And specifically, this is like a panel with somebody who was espousing some kind of Zionist talking points or something like that in this particular instance.
I don't know the details about that, but what I do know is that, it's a two-way street, and it's good to have standards. It's also good to recognize what you bring to the table and be realistic about what you bring to the table. And I've seen people who I don't think understand that the national organization right now doesn't bring a ton to the table, and that's okay. And it's acknowledging like where your strengths and weaknesses are is what's most important about like assessing the terrain that you're organizing on. And so, and that's not to say anything about any individual case, but I definitely think we could use like a conversation about like, what do we bring to the table? And not just nationally, but locally. Like one of the reasons that we've been able to get people elected is not because, there's a new consciousness forming and working people across the country.
That's so abstract, isn't it?
Yeah. I think what's much more likely is there's been a layer of people who have decided to get involved in elections, who agree, who share our values. It's us in this room right now that have decided to get involved in elections.
All the nerds are coming together.
And we are willing to work harder than the other side. And that's how I was elected. And so, and that's how I've been able to continue and push forward. And so acknowledging that that is the case, and that, everybody in your local municipality, everybody in your congressional district is going to have normal people thoughts and not necessarily understand in depth things like the mode of production in society and what the difference between a cooperative business and a publicly owned business and a privately owned business is. Like, grapple with those issues and actually like get your hands dirty in the contradictions. And I think that's what would be best for the organization as a whole. And so basically I'm just saying, like, admitting what we do well and what we don't do well, and then seeing if we can get better, I think is a thing that's missing from the conversation. But I also want to just end quickly on this point, which is stop talking about Congress all the time. Like,
yes,
in the
oh my
bluntest
God.
way I can say it. Like, there are other things going on. Sometimes, yeah, it's important. But like, I'll just say, like,
they're watching Shakespeare, man. They're watching the plays. They're watching the soap operas and all the other BS.
Like, it should take up space in the conversation. But again, like, no one knows what I'm up to. Like, that's outside of my local chapter, unless we share it on social media. Like, I could have betrayed the working class 25 times over by now. How do you know I didn't? You don't know because you haven't been paying attention. Like, I haven't. I mean, you can ask my chapter; they'll back me up on that.
That's good.
But like, I could have, and you don't know. Like,
the only person that might say that is Anthony.
Yeah, no, Anthony, our friend from Tampa. He, I guess it's a betrayal to the local working class to root for a different football team, to root for one 90 miles down the road instead of 25 miles down the road. But okay. So anyway, I think our electoral conversation could really use sort of, to be blunt, like a more localist perspective. And really be thought about more in the long term than the immediate term, and what we're building with all of the cadre that we've gotten elected, and sort of an acknowledgement of like where our power is and isn't when it comes to like the federal level, and does that mean we want to continue to engage, knowing that our power is not what it is, or what we bring to the table is not what we would like for it to be. Or maybe we don't engage, but having a good faith conversation about that, I think, is really important, and not saying that like to take the elected official out of it and talk about, the other members, like the members that are supporting, still engaging, even though it's a coalitional effort and we're not getting the final say, and the members who are saying, no, we shouldn't. Like, I don't think when it comes to the members, like, it's a difference in their values. I think it's a difference in their strategy. And I think that, being honest with each other about that is only going to be beneficial to the organization.
Yeah. So I guess we're sort of winding down. Robert, any final questions?
I just wanted to co-sign on all that, because I was just thinking of, just had a dumb online fight with, somebody. It's like, we're going to get into it, super in the next couple months, but it's just about the presidential horse race. And it's like, I'm not going to vote for Kamala because she's a cop. And I'm like, okay, that's fine. But that you saying that isn't going to get anybody to change positions on anything. What you should be doing is saying things like the uncommitted voters in Michigan are saying is, we will vote for you if you do X. Instead of saying we will not vote for you, because then they'll just try to figure out a way around you. So why don't just give them an opening to the path of least resistance? Stop the genocide, you win the state. It's that easy. Instead of saying, well, I'm just not gonna vote. And that's okay. That's fine. I get it, but understand that's not.
You're not doing very good negotiation right there.
Exactly. You're already. So if you're just take the DSA endorsement, and I'll end on this. If you are endorsing somebody willy-nilly, then you are giving away leverage. If you are not endorsing somebody willy-nilly, you're also giving away leverage, or taking your endorsement away, I should say, if that makes sense. Jeff, please take my words and make them make sense.
Oh boy, that's a lot of pressure.
I know, right?
But like,
Makes sense to me.
No, but like essentially,
Right.
like how organizations relate to elected
Carrot
officials
stick.
matters. Like how organizations relate to elected officials matter, and just like by essentially like sitting on your hands or like crossing your arms and saying I'm not going to get involved with this isn't gonna that's not going to solve any problems necessarily. Is my sort of like interpretation of that.
Yeah, that's what I heard as well. Is that trying to over leverage your hand doesn't get you anywhere, and under leveraging your hand doesn't get you anywhere either. So,
bro, this might be the spiciest
definitely
thing. This might be the spiciest thing I say.
It's a
Like
good
the
one to
left,
end
the leftists and leftists, not even necessarily leftist organizations, but they definitely do this. They often think that they have leverage where they don't, and there's this sort of like idea that they can sort of like not engage, or they can like have influence in places where they've completely evacuated any kind of even attempt at influence on it. I don't know.
No,
That's a little bit
100%.
spicy.
No, that's
and
100%.
I don't know if you want to touch that, but
100%.
I mean, I'll say it's kind of what I've been getting at. It's just like
Mhm.
being realistic about what kind of power we have and what we don't. And, and let me take it a step back. Like I've seen people, let's use AOC as an example, even though I keep saying, stop talking about her.
yeah,
I've seen people on both sides of that debate be realistic. And I've seen people on both sides of that debate
Yeah,
be
totally.
unrealistic as well. And, but the thing that I want to impart upon people is like, having a comradely conversation about it instead of like impinging people's morals or whatever is frustrating. God. And recognizing that like a lot of this conversation and the harshness of it has really zapped the energy out of our electoral project in general.
Absolutely.
And recognizing that like the fact that we had Bernie Sanders running for president like was just a gift, and now it's on us like to figure out how to actually build a movement that can unite people. And so we should be thinking about uniting people all the time. Like that's what we should be thinking about. And like, where is there an electoral project that can bring people together? And for us in Pinellas County, Florida, St. Petersburg, we have focused on building a strong local electoral operation that focuses on municipal races in our county. And we have like a positive vision about what public goods and services can look like. And we're uniting people locally on it. And so I would love to see that conversation be like that. We're uniting people who are on every side of the conversation in the national politics. But I'd love to see that conversation happen like with the org. Like, all right, where do we align on electoral politics? And if it's that there are just big splits in the org over what we should and shouldn't be doing, we need to hash those out, and where we can agree, move forward, and where we can't agree, say, okay, that's fine, you go work on this, I'll go work on this, it's no big deal. Like
totally. Richie Floyd, where can people find you and what you're up to?
I'm on social media at Richie J Floyd, RICHIE, the letter J, then FLOYD, on Twitter and Instagram there. I'm on Facebook. You can just look me up, Richie Floyd for St. Pete City Council. And feel free to follow me, tweet at me. I'll respond. Like, I like to get into it to an extent, but I like to keep it positive and focused on what our broad goals are for working people in general. And, it's about the orgs that I'm in, but it's really comes down to making sure that the people who get stuff done in the city, the workers, get their due.
Well, appreciate you coming on here, and that is rad. And again, thanks Richie Floyd, and also thank you to James for making this possible, for linking us up. Really appreciate that. Thanks everybody for listening to this week's Good Morning Comrade. Robert, anything to say in the last 10 seconds?
No, big up to my dad down there in St. Pete.
All right, Richie.
Tell your dad vote for Nick Carey, City Council District 3 in the citywide election.
A long time ago.
He gave it up.
All right, well, we're still going to go out there and ride hard for him. So
I'll tell you to harass him.
All right, sounds good.
Drop the D.
Thanks so much, brother.
All right, yeah.
All right.
All right.